Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. This week, I talk with Dr. Dennis vanEngelsdorp, Assistant Professor of Entomology at the University of Maryland in the United States and Project Director for the Bee Informed Partnership. He's also the forming actor Chief Apiarist in Pennsylvania, and is widely known and been very influential in his work with bees on a phenomenon called colony collapse disorder. In this episode, we briefly discuss the wonderful world of bees and why bees matter. We first explore the historical significance of bees, how our relationship with bees has evolved, and address perhaps some of the misconceptions surrounding bees and what they do and what they truly are. We then dive into why bees matter in terms of sustainability, about this wonderful coevolution between flowers and pollinators, the role of beekeepers and how our food production relies on bees, and about the prospects of a world without bees. We then finish off with the mystery of colony collapse disorder, the rapid loss of the adult bee population, where we are now, and what we can all do to support these little fascinating creatures. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Dennis vanEngelsdorp. Dennis, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh no, happy to be here.
So before we dive in, I'm actually really curious to know a little bit more about what drove you personally towards bees, I guess more specifically, but towards entomology in general. So could you maybe start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
So I was actually an undergraduate. I was an undergraduate at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and that's the big ag school up in Canada.
Right.
And I was a horticulture undergrad, and I had my own gardening company, and it was doing really well. I mean, we had a lot of really good clients, including the inventors of Trivial Pursuit. And so it was going well. And then I took an undergraduate course in beekeeping. And I really fell in love. And they have a saying in the bee world, once stung, it's in your blood, and you're a beekeeper for life. And that was certainly true for me. And so I went out and bought beehives, and I keep going up to the professor with all these really basic bee questions. Right. It's funny because I get a lot of those questions still today. And I think I was driving him crazy a bit. So he asked if I wanted to do a master's. And so I did, and I just really like bees. I've been doing bees ever since. After my master's, I worked in the Caribbean for 5 years, working with people there to increase beekeeping skills and work with the beekeeping cooperative there. I then moved to the States, worked at Cornell for a while, and in Penn State and the Department of Ag, where I was the acting state apiarist, and I realized I wanted to do a PhD, so I did that part-time just as CCD broke, or colony collapse disorder broke, and so that became the emphasis of my work, which I worked on part-time, and graduated, I guess, in 2011. And so then I got this job here at the University of Maryland as assistant professor. I think I would be a beekeeper if I was handy. I'm just not very mechanical. I tend to daydream a lot, so I think I'd use my fingers on the saw or something. And I tend to enjoy statistics, and so I guess I'm doing the next best thing, which is to study the bees and the beekeepers who keep them, actually. Yeah,
that's pretty great. I mean, I'm guessing you still have a lot of interaction with them, so it's definitely the second best thing there. I really want to get into, I guess, the kind of focus of your work, around CCD, colony collapse disorder. But before we do that, maybe we could start off by just talking about bees more generally, about those silly little questions that you keep getting asked for the listeners out there. Because I'm fascinated by bees, and I guess I haven't been stung yet, so maybe that's still to come. But
well, maybe you need to come and open up a colony of bees. Yeah, but there's a real vibrant beekeeping community on top of the roofs in Paris.
Exactly.
And there's some really good people who are studying bees there at the veterinarian college in Paris, that famous, I forget its name, but it's the famous vet college in Paris. So there's a lot of good people out there. You're asking me about a little bit about the bees. Some of those questions are really technical that unless you're a beekeeper, you wouldn't understand, like why is my honey going hard, or the drones getting kicked out. So I'm not sure they're all that they're great if you're a beginner beekeeper, but I'm not sure that they're that informative if you're a general audience. I think the take home message though is that I really think that everyone owes it to themselves to open a hive of colonies at least once.
Right.
And it's an amazing experience. I mean, it's transformative in many ways, because here you are, you're going to have to be calm. You have to get into the zen of beekeeping. Otherwise, the bees will let you know. So you have to find that calm. And you open this colony, and here you're holding this frame of 30,000 sisters with your bare hands, working in harmony. You're surrounded by these smells of pine needles and beeswax and ripening honey.
Right.
And here they are. The birds are singing. They're working on this comb, making this liquid gold. There's the queen. She's long, slender, and sexy, walking around in that comb. I mean, there's not much that can beat that experience. And then you can start thinking about, well, how does this all happen? How are they getting involved in making all these decisions? How do they fight disease? And there are theories like, should we consider a bee an individual? There's a Latin saying, una apis, non apis. A bee is not a bee. And that's because we really shouldn't think of bees as individuals, but this collective social organism.
Right.
And so what does that mean, being a social organism, about decision making and how they do the things they do? So there's just an endless supply of questions to be fascinated by.
Right. So I guess, I mean, the best way to do, like you said, is just to learn by doing, to jump right in. And that's, I guess, the best way, because I think people often have a misconception about bees. I mean, often people, you associate your bees with honey, but beyond that, they're just another insect for a lot of people to be avoided. And I think that's often because of the stinger. So, I mean, yeah, I guess the best way is to jump in. And I was also thinking, I mean, at least historically, our relationship with bees, the relationship between bees and human beings, and the role of bees in society is really interesting too, right? I mean, that goes back, I mean, centuries.
Oh, yeah. No. That goes back thousands of years. I mean, if you look at some of the first cave paintings, those are of actually women climbing up a hemp rope collecting honey from a colony that's on a cliff face. And so remember, honeybees are old world. And so in the old world, back in the day, there was no sugar. There wasn't sugar cane or any other sugar other than that was produced by honey. Right. So you can imagine it had this really high import. That's why it's sometimes referred to as the nectar of gods. It was this unbelievable flavor. And so we joke in the bee world that beekeeping is the second oldest profession known to man. And that's because we've been at it for a long time.
Right.
Some of these associations are so ingrained that birds have evolved to help us. So if you're in the savannas of Africa and you can recruit a honey guide bird, this honey guide bird will whistle and fly and whistle and fly, and you can follow it, and it will eventually lead you to a honeybee colony. The idea is that when you find that honeybee colony and you collect the honey, some of the honey you leave behind for the honey guide bird, and some you take for yourself. And so that association wouldn't have happened overnight. And so that indicates this really long relationship we've had with bees and, in this case, birds.
Yeah, I mean, come to think of it, I think the ancient Egyptians used bees too, right? I mean, I read something about them floating bees on rafts down the Nile to get them from one crop to another. So that not so much, I guess, for honey as for pollination. Is that, am I getting that right?
The ancient Egyptians, I don't know, would have been, I think they would probably be doing it to follow the honey, which correlates with the thing. I don't know about the ancient Egyptians, but certainly it was important. I mean, there's a very famous tomb of a tax collector, I think. And inside his tomb, he has a complete depiction of how they used to collect honey back in the day. Also, the queen bee was a symbol for, I think, Upper Egypt, which gives you an idea of how important bees were to that society.
Right. And I guess fast forwarding a little bit, I mean, in the 1950s and 60s, you had this whole media hype about a killer bee, which I know was just, I mean, as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was very much just a sensationalism of just a bee that was migrating from, I think it was from Africa to South America. But do you think that's kind of responsible as well for some of the fears that people have for bees? It's this misconception of the kind of what bees are and what they do.
Well, certainly, I mean, we call them Africanized bees now, not killer bees.
Right.
They certainly are much more defensive. And so this was a strain of bees that originated right in the deserts of Africa. And so you can imagine this is a pretty hardy bee. There are badgers there. There's all sorts of things that want to eat that honey. And so they're pretty defensive. So for every one sting that you would get from a European honeybee hive, which is what we usually manage here,
right,
you get 10 or 20 from an Africanized beehive. And so they can get pretty mean pretty quick. But those Africanized bees have some really good genes for beekeepers who are working in the tropics. And so if a Brazilian bee scientist brought over some, and they forgot to put on a little gate in front of the colony one day. And the swarms took off, and they have now spread throughout South America, up through Central America, into Texas and other southern states. Certainly, Africanized bees pose a public health risk. I mean, they can be defensive. You have to manage them. You don't want them to do the same things.
Right.
But honeybees do get a bad rap. I think that in most places, people who get stung by a bee, it's really not a bee. It's been a wasp, and people confuse bees and wasps. Bees don't have any interest in stinging you other than to tell you to stop bothering their hive or to make sure you associate their very distinctive colored striping and buzz with something bad so you don't step on them again.
Right.
And so they have no interest in stinging you other than to defend or to teach. And so as long as you're calm, as long as you're not doing anything you don't want to do, bees are generally safe.
And so, I mean, not all bees even have stingers, right? I mean, we're talking here specifically about honeybees, but if you look at kind of the species of bees as a whole, I mean, isn't it still a minority that are honeybees and bumblebees, the kind of social bees? I think you call them. Aren't there a lot more? I think, are they called solitary bees or antisocial bees? There's so many different types of bees out there.
Yeah, there are thousands of species of bees. I mean, and some of these are amazing, and they do, as you suggest, live solitary lives by and large. So they might be out only for 2 weeks in the year and only pollinate one plant. And so what they do is they collect that pollen and they build these nests, either in the soil or in twigs, and they'll put a pollen ball on it, lay an egg, and then cap it over, and then have all these cells that were these solitary bees. These bees are very beautiful. They're amazing. I mean, they're these flying gemstones, really. Here on campus at the University of Maryland, we started a survey. We've identified over 100 species of bees right here on campus. Again, 99% of them don't sting and go largely unnoticed.
Right.
So I think that there is a real benefit to seeing those creatures survive and prosper as well.
Great. That's really interesting. There's just so many different types, like there were carpenter bees and plaster bees and leaf cutters, just all these different bees with slightly different functions, and just kind of open a whole new world, really. Yeah,
there's a great website. I don't know if you got to it, the USDA Geological Service. They have a website, Sam Droege, and he has all these pictures of solitary bees.
Okay.
And they're just, like, I mean, you can watch that for hours. Like, I mean, it's just incredible what they look like. I mean, everyone should get out there and take a look at that. It's amazing.
Yeah, I saw a really interesting TED Talk after yours as well, where they were showing a time lapse of, and I think these were honeybees, of just right in the honeycomb, and kind of how they went from what would you call
larva.
The larva, exactly. Yeah. And that
honeybees are like butterflies, right? So
right.
You have an egg, a larva, a pupa, and an adult. Except unlike caterpillars, they don't walk around to get the food. They're waiting for other bees to bring them the food. And those bees eat like pollen, which they turn into something like bee milk that they regurgitate for those bees. And then they develop. And it's in the larval stage that they do all their growing. And then they pupate. And that video there is a really good demonstration of how you can see them develop.
Yeah, and don't they also, when they collect pollen and they collect nectar, and they make something called bee bread, which just sounds fantastic. Maybe that's just a nickname, but I thought that was great.
Well, no, bee bread is what we call it because it's not pollen anymore. So bees are true vegetarians. They don't get any protein other than through honey or through pollen. And so in order to store it, they bring it back to the hive and they pack it down with their head and they add some honey and enzymes and yeast to help it ferment. And that makes that outer shell, pollen, the husk on pollen is very hard. That helps sort of break that down. So when the bees eat it, they can digest through that shell, and the fat and the good stuff and the protein gets released and they can digest it.
Right.
And so actually bee bread is really important, because if they didn't make this bee bread, they wouldn't be able to eat the pollen as well and get as much nutrients from it.
That's fascinating. No, I know we're dwelling on this a little bit, but just the little weird and wonderful functions of bees I found so fascinating when I was reading about them. I mean, I read as well about their way of communicating through dance, right? So the fact that they use the sun to navigate, and then they have a type of dance floor almost within the honeycomb.
Right. So actually, this was the guy who found it was a German who got the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this discovery, because basically what bees can do is if they find a really good food source, they come back to the colony and want to tell their nestmates about it in order to get other people to work on, say, this blooming apple tree. And so what they do is they know from the entrance of the colony at what angle that location is and how far it is.
Right.
And so when they go back into the nest, they dance and say, okay, pretend the sun is straight up, and I'm going to dance at an angle so that when you go out, look at the sun and fly at this angle relative to the sun. And then depending on how fast they move their abdomen or their butt back and forth, it tells them how far to go. And so they communicate this information, so other bees looking for good forage locations will pick it up and be able to fly to that location. Now, there are some people who are so good at this, they can look at dancing bees and tell you exactly where in the landscape you should go to find that flower. And so it's a very predictable way of communicating, and it's amazingly accurate.
Wow, that's fascinating. Also about about the queen bee, I thought this was fantastic too. That it's the queen that lays most of the but that also decides, what gender to breed. Could you elaborate a little on that and how that kind of works, how that system works?
Right. So bees are part of this bigger group of organisms, like Hymenoptera, that include wasps and ants. So bees, wasps, and ants are part of this bigger group. And that group, the entire group, their way of determining sex is a little bit different than ours, in that unfertilized eggs become male and fertilized eggs become female. And so honeybee queens, when she first emerges, she goes out and mates in the first 2 weeks of her life, and she'll mate with 16 or more drones, and then she'll store all of that sperm in a bag, a spermatheca, in her abdomen. And so she'll live to some records of 5 years, and she will use that sperm that's been stored in that spermatheca for her entire life. And she can lay as many as 1,200 eggs a day. And so that's a lot of sperm that she contains in that spermatheca. What she does is when she goes to lay an egg, she actually measures the comb or the wax cell. And if it's small, when she lays her egg, she pushes the egg against the opening to the spermatheca so it can get fertilized.
Right.
If, however, that cell is a little bit bigger, she senses that, and so she doesn't allow the egg to pass just over the entrance to the spermatheca and lays an unfertilized egg. The experiment they did to prove this was they actually glued a stick to the forelegs of the queen, and the stick was exactly the length of a worker cell. And then they put it on drone comb, which is the male bee comb, and they put her in there. And so because she couldn't move her legs bigger than the stick or the string between her front legs, right, she thought it was all worker cells. And so she laid worker fertilized eggs in all the drone cells. So that's how we know that little bit of information, which is a sort of a cool experiment.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's brilliant. Now that we have a little bit more of an understanding of bees in general, in terms of sustainability, and I think this is where your work starts to come in more. Why, someone that's interested in sustainability, why do bees matter?
Well, bees matter because all flowering plants, so plants that have conspicuous blooms, big blooms, dicotyledons, fruits and vegetables, require insect pollination. And honeybees tend to be the most efficient pollinators of crops. They're generalists. They go to lots of different flowers. And there's a lot of them in one box. And so you can move them in and you can move them out, which is an essential component in modern agriculture, because there are lots of places, like, say, California almonds, where it is great for bees during the almond bloom, but there's nothing left after the almond bloom is over.
Right.
And so the bees wouldn't sustain themselves all year round. So I think that if we're interested in continuing to produce fruits and vegetables, and by that I also mean the seeds to produce fruits and vegetables. So for instance, carrots don't require pollination to produce a carrot,
Right.
but you need pollination to produce the carrot seed. And so there's all industries in Oregon and on the West Coast that all they're doing is producing seed for food production in other places. And so for that, you need insect pollinators, and honeybees tend to be the most versatile. Now, there's a lot of evidence that if you have both native pollinators and honeybees in the same system, that the fruit set is better and is of higher quality. So it's not excluding other bees, but you need those pollinators. And in a way, that relationship between flowering plants and insects is one of the most beautiful evolutionary stories there are, because it's a dance. It's not a competitive dance, but it was this dance of plants wanting to attract pollinators, and so making bigger and more smelly and more beautiful or more attractive flowers, attracting them. So flowers are really the first forms of advertisement, these big gaudy displays and this green canopy telling bees to come and pollinate me. And so in a way, just looking at that association between bees and flowers is fascinating. And in some cases, some bees are so specialized, like orchid bees. They only pollinate one type of orchid plant. Some of these bees have gone extinct, but we can tell what the orchid bee once looked like because the flowers imitate the female orchid bee. And the idea is that the male will then go and try to mate with the flower, get stuck as the pollen dries on his head, so that when he releases, he can go and try to mate with another flower and do the same. And so this one species of orchid bee is extinct, but we know what it looks like because we see the flower, and so we know what the female once looked like.
Wow. So that bee stayed exclusively to that one type of plant.
Yeah, with some orchids, there's nearly a 1-to-1 relationship between its pollinator and not. And there's lots of cases like this. Like that, bees aren't the only pollinator, but you have some beautiful flowers that are really, really long and tubular. And so when Darwin went to Madagascar, he found one of these flowers, and he said, well, there has to be a moth with a tongue that's this long.
Right.
And it was only in the last 10 years that actually I think we found the moth that he predicted in Madagascar, just based on looking at that flower. So sometimes those associations are really tight.
That's really interesting. And what's the role then of the beekeeper here, in terms of how do we influence this, I guess, what was once a natural relationship that didn't involve humans? Where do we come in?
Well, I think we come in a couple of ways. One, it's important to remember that honeybees are not native to North America, nor are apples and nor are almonds. And so we brought a lot of plants over that are food crops that evolved with honeybees. We also are producing food. So honeybees are important in order to pollinate food that is grown in orchards and in non-natural systems. And so you need to supplement and bring them in and then take them out before you spray pesticides or whatever you're doing in those areas.
Right.
So I think that beekeepers are important in this system, especially in North America where they're not native, in the fact that what in some ways they're doing is helping pollinate crops that would not be growing here naturally anyway, because they're not native for here.
Right.
There are other crops like squash that have squash bees that are native, but honeybees tend to be much more efficient at the commercial level than not. Because you can bring in tens of thousands at one time and then take them out right away.
And so what happens when you take the bees out of the equation? I think I read somewhere that you have certain situations where people can manually, I guess, artificially pollinate. How does that work?
Well, for instance, honeybees aren't very good in greenhouses. And so they use, for like when they're making tomatoes in greenhouses, tomatoes require something called buzz pollinator. And so bumblebees, when they land on a flower, will actually buzz the flower, and that sort of sneaks out the pollen. And so in the shortage of, say bumblebees in a greenhouse setting, they will have vibrators that go around and do the buzz pollinator. There are reports in China where there's a very high quality pair in a region that there are just no bees anymore. And so they go around with cotton swabs and hand pollinate. But that's not very efficient.
Right. Better to leave it to the bees if possible.
If there are bees are better. Yeah.
Right. And so I guess in this kind of world without bees, I guess this brings us on to colony collapse disorder and kind of where your work focuses on primarily. Could you explain to the listeners out there what colony collapse disorder is, when it came about, and what it's like today, what relevance it still has today?
So colony collapse disorder in 2006, I was a state apiarist in Pennsylvania, and a beekeeper, the largest beekeeper in the state, was bragging in October about how good his bees were. They were the best bees he's ever had. And he moved them down to Florida, as he does every year, right, a month later, and he talks about getting out of his truck and it being completely silent and there not being any bees in any of his colonies. Gets on his hands and knees, looking into the entrances, no bees anywhere.
Vanished.
And so it was clear that this was happening in other operations too. And so this is when we put a team together. We went to sample. And that's when we came up with the term colony collapse disorder to describe a very specific way that colonies were dying that was unique. And this involved the rapid loss of the adult bee population, which you saw evidence of because there was still a lot of brood left in the colony, and bees don't abandon their young very often.
Right.
If there were bees left in these colonies, they were young and the queen was still there. When colonies left, the honey stores that they had left didn't get robbed out by other bees, which is sort of unusual. And so there were very clear sets of symptoms that occurred with this mass loss. And we saw this last happen in operations, and we could see it spread throughout operations. So we did a whole bunch of tests trying to figure it out, and I think the long and short of it was these colonies were dying from viral infections, not the same viral infection, but it all suggested that something underlying weakened their immune system, so they became susceptible. I want to say that since then, a lot of people start using colony collapse disorder to describe any dead colony, which was not our intent by the definition. And in fact, I haven't seen verifiable CCD in the country for the last 5 years. And so I think CCD on its own was an example of an emerging disease where it had this major outbreak and then sort of petered off, which suggests to me that maybe we missed a type of virus or something else that went on. But as a result of this, we started paying attention to colony losses much more carefully. And in doing so, it was clear that colonies were dying at very high rates all the time, not all by CCD. And so this is why we're still trying to figure out what causes colony losses. I think there's consensus that it's 3 major drivers. The first, and I think the most important, in Europe and in North America, is the varroa mite, these very large parasitic mites that feed on the bees, and they pass viruses to the bees. And the virus is important here because I think it's the viruses that knock the bees out, but the varroa are the ones that transfer. It's sort of like Zika. If you don't have the mosquito, you're not going to get Zika.
Right.
And so that's the same cycle. But it's clearly not just varroa. There are other things too. One is the loss of habitat, and it's been amazing how many acres of meadows have been plowed under, and are no longer available as bee forage. And the third is pesticides. Both the pesticides beekeepers apply to control varroa in their hive, and pesticides farmers are applying and the bees are bringing back. What's troubling about the pesticide story is a lot of people are concentrating on neonics.
Right.
And certainly neonics are bad for non-honeybees. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that they hurt bumblebees and solitary bees much more dramatically than honeybees. There's not a lot of evidence that neonics are harming colonies at the colony level. I really want to say that again. It's pretty clear that this class of pesticides can hurt non-honeybees.
Right. But
honeybees, largely because they're this social organism, largely because they're that super organism where if you have 30% of that workforce is actually extra workforce, you can lose 30% of the workforce and the colony not suffer anything. And so because of that, they don't seem to be harmed by neonics as bad. There's no real world evidence that neonics are hurting colonies at the colony level. However, we are finding, and this is surprising, that other things like fungicides, which are safe for bees, a bee can walk through a pool of fungicide, no problem, apparent problem at all. However, we're finding that things like fungicides at the colony level may be having these negative effects because those colonies are much more likely to die. So it's a sublethal effect. I think that's why this story is so confusing, is that we have all these interacting effects, and they interact and make other things worse. So, for instance, if you have a pesticide exposure, you often have a higher mite per bee concentration because you've killed some of the bees, but the mites have stayed the same. That population stayed the same. So you have more mites per bee, which can cause a collapse that looks like a varroa collapse. And so it's a very complicated network of risk factors that are interacting. And I think that that's why there's so much frustration that we haven't got solutions. And that's because there's not going to be a simple solution. There's not going to be a smoking gun. And so we have to sort of tease apart all the different factors and try to figure out how to mediate them.
So what are the kind of initiatives that you're working on now, I guess, to maybe not prevent, but at least be prepared for the possibility of another outbreak of the sort that you saw with colony collapse disorder? Are there things that we can prepare for?
Well, I think that there are things that we are doing. We're monitoring, first of all. So now we have a National Honeybee Disease Surveillance program where we do collect colonies across the country and test them for various diseases, and we monitor levels. And this is how we know that mite levels are much higher than they should be in many places at critical times in the year, and so probably are a real driver for a lot of losses. And as a result of that, we have got a lot of initiatives trying to get beekeepers to monitor their mite levels, and this is a real surprise to us because there are beekeepers who treat for mites, get their mites down right low, and then a month later they have mites 3 times higher than they should be, and it's impossible that those mite levels increase that way naturally. And so we think what's happening is that there are other beekeepers out there who don't treat for mites. Their colonies die and crash from mites, and those bees then, those last bees, fly over and invade other bees in the neighborhood and jump their mite levels up. And so it's a complicated factor because it seems like they're spreading. So it's not just your issues, it's your neighbor's issues that are your issues too. And so we have this landscape level. And so we're really encouraging beekeepers to monitor mite levels and report them in public forums. So we're trying this unfunded project called Mite Check, where people can do mite checks and put that online so people can see what their levels are in different states in the country. Right. We also have this Sentinel Apiary program, where in a very systematic way we collect and report samples and put samples down. We also developed tech transfer teams, which are groups of 2 people who work intensely with 20 commercial beekeepers, sampling their colonies on regular intervals in order to give them actionable results. And so I think a lot of the work that we've done right now is we've tried to borrow pages from the human health, public health, where they're trying to get messaging out in order to encourage a healthy human population. Right. We're trying to use those same tools, both their statistical tools and their outreach tools, to apply that to honeybee health to try to decrease how many colonies get lost every year.
That's really interesting. In terms of I guess the individuals out there that are interested in bees and in kind of doing their part, I mean, what would you suggest to, you talked about in your TED Talk about nature deficit disorder. So, I mean, what would you suggest? Is there a role for your average individual in this as well, and kind of keeping bees healthy? And
yeah, I think there are 3 things that people can do. First, it's think about becoming a beekeeper. And I think it's a very relaxing thing. And once you're involved, I think you become more informed and you become a better advocate. But it's not for everybody. And so failing that, you can buy local honey. Honey is certainly local honey is the most ethical sweetener because it took the least amount of carbon to get to your table, and you're supporting your local beekeepers. And third, and I think this is really exciting, is that we have to start planting pollinator gardens and meadows. And I think that this is good, not just for bees, but for you too. I mean, I can think of little that's been more enjoyable than trying to convert lawns into meadows or into pollinator gardens, where you have different flowers flowering at different times of the year. And there's a whole bunch of pollinators, butterflies and moths and all these other bees that are supported by that system. And so I think that that's a really big thing too, is that we should re-examine our addiction to pristine, green, flat lawns and make meadows instead. And I think the world would be a better place for many reasons if we did that.
I agree. I mean, I one thing that pops to mind, though, and maybe it's the same, some of the listeners out there, is if you do live in cities, you have this perception that, I don't have acres of space for meadows, or, I mean, what would you say to people living in cities that want to do their bit, but don't sound exactly enthusiastic about having a beehive in a little apartment? What are those people?
Well, there are very active bee communities in cities. It's rooftop beekeeping is a big thing.
Right.
But there's always a place. There's local green places and getting on councils there and trying to say, okay, can we plant a pollinator garden? Looking at where there's a lot of excessive mowed lawn and seeing, well, what pressures can we put to bear to make that a lawn or a meadow? There's also a lot of bureaucracy. There's some places that it's illegal to have a meadow in your front yard. It's ridiculous. And so we need to fight those sort of ideas as well. And if you have a balcony, I mean, there's nothing saying you can't grow a lot of these pollinator plants as in a pot.
Exactly.
And so you can do that too. So I think there's a lot people can do if they're willing to be creative and think about it. I know one of the initiatives we have here on campus is our University of Maryland campus is really in the suburbs of DC. And so we're really trying to figure out, well, how do we make our campus more pollinator friendly?
Right.
And once you start thinking about it, you come up with a whole bunch of good ideas.
That sounds great. You've convinced me.
All right, good.
And I do live in a bee-friendly city, so it's definitely something I can try out in the coming weeks.
Yeah, good.
Well, thanks so much, Dennis, for being on the show with us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Maybe a website or somewhere where people can find out more about your work and what you're up to, and other talks or interesting books they should check out?
Well, I mean, if you're a beekeeper, the beeinformed.org website is where we try to convey a lot of the information that we're doing in real time. There's a lot of good sources of information for pollinator guides out there, like the Xerces Society and pollinators.org, where you can get a lot of really good information on what pollinator plants to plant.
Besides the websites that Dennis has already mentioned, I also highly recommend his TED Talk called A Plea for Bees. As always, of course, all of these links you can find in the description below. Okay, well, that's the end of today's episode. I hope you guys liked it. If you did, you can support the podcast by subscribing to iTunes, by rating and reviewing the podcast. You can, of course, as always, like the Facebook page, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, or you can share it with friends and family if you think they might be interested in this episode or in any of the other episodes. All of the content and more is, of course, also available on www.forfoodsake.me. In next week's episode, we'll be sticking to the topic of insects, but from a slightly different perspective. We'll be talking about edible insects with Robert Nathan Allen, the founder of Little Herds, which is an organization educating and promoting edible insects as a sustainable and nutritious solution for food and feed. So be sure to join me next week to hear all about edible insects. See you then.